Is Labor about to change the property market forever? Because Chris Hipkins, Labor's leader, has just announced that he wants to introduce a capital gains tax, New Zealand's most debated tax, one that could see landlords paying hundreds of thousands of dollars more each year to the IRD. Hi, I'm Ed, an economist and property investor at Opes Partners, and since Labor have announced this policy, I've been talking to the party, to policymakers, trying to understand how this tax would work. And it's raised three important questions. Who would have to pay the tax? What's the chance it actually comes in? And what would it do to house prices? And we're going to answer those three questions in today's video. But just remember, I'm a property investor, not a politician. So I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, but politicians' policies do impact you as a property investor, so we've got to talk about them. But my promise to you is that I'll stick to the policies and the facts rather than tell you which box to tick on election day. Now, Labor's proposing a flat 28% tax that you'd pay if you sell an investment property for more than you bought it for. So let's say you buy a rental property for $500,000. You do that in July 2027 when this kicks in. And let's say you sell that $500,000 property 10 years later for $1 million. Well, congratulations to you. You made a $500,000 profit. Now, if this tax passes, you keep $360,000 of that, and the IRD takes the other $140K. Now, since this policy has been announced, a lot of investors have been emailing me asking me, well, what about a property that you already own? So let's say you bought a property a decade ago, you paid $300,000 for it, and today it's worth $700K. If this policy passes, are you going to have to pay tax on the $400,000 gain that you've already made? Well, the answer is no. You only pay tax on any house price increases that you get after July 2027. But let's say that we're a year into the future, it's 2027, the policy comes in. At that point, your property's still worth $700K. You hold on to it for another 5 years and then you sell it for $1 million. That first $400,000 you made from the house going up in value, that's still tax-free. But the extra $300K gain that you made after July 2027, that's the part that the IRD would take a slice of. But it's not just investment properties that this applies to, even though it's mainly property investors who have been talking about this. It's any property other than the main home that you live in. So holiday homes, your batch, commercial properties, or maybe you own a business like a dairy and that business owns the building that the dairy's in. All of those properties would have to pay this tax. But let's say you inherit a property from Nana. She's 70 years old and she bought her property ages ago for 3 tuppence and now it's worth $1 million. None of her gains would be taxed if you inherit that property, but you would of course pay tax on any house price increases that happen after you inherit the property. Now, what does Labor want to do with all this extra money that they'd make through this tax? Well, they're planning to ring fence it for healthcare. So that way, every Kiwi would get 3 free GP visits every single year. But this brings us to another really important question. What's the chance that this policy actually comes in? Because it is just a proposal at the moment. Although I told you that I'm not a politician, I still do read political polls because I'm a bit of a nerd like that. And there are good reasons to think that this policy could come in. Labor are polling really well at the moment. In 5 out of the last 7 political polls, Labor actually outpolled National. More people are saying they'd vote for Labor compared to National. So in the next election, or after the next election, they could be the largest party in Parliament, unless these numbers change. And while some media commentators have said that a capital gains tax is a vote killer, a Radio New Zealand poll that came out not that long ago found that a capital gains tax might be more popular than you think. 43% of people in that poll say that they support a capital gains tax on properties except for the family home. That compares to just 36% of people who say no, they're opposed to that sort of tax, with the rest undecided. So more people, at least in this poll, want a capital gains tax compared to the people who say they don't want it. But there are also reasons to think that maybe this capital gains tax won't come in, because although Labor is polling really well compared to National, once you include their potential coalition partners, the centre-right parties, ACT, New Zealand First National, are slightly outpolling the centre-left parties, Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori. Remember, it does not matter in New Zealand which party is the biggest. What matters is which coalition has the most seats. So, if National, ACT, New Zealand First get more seats than Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, then this policy won't get introduced. It won't become law. But if Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori win more seats, then a capital gains tax is almost certain. On top of that, although a capital gains tax is popular with some voters, it hasn't been an election winner in the past. Remember, Labour campaigned on a capital gains tax in both the 2011 and 2014 elections and lost both of them. They then won the 2017 election while campaigning on a capital gains tax. But once you factored in the coalition partners, they needed the support of New Zealand First to get that tax across the line, and New Zealand First's leader, Winston Peters, was the self-described handbrake, and he killed the tax. Now, reading the current polls, on balance, a year out from the election, I think it's slightly more likely that this tax doesn't get passed compared to the likelihood that it comes in. But that's just my gut feeling. So what I really want to know is, what do you think? Let me know how likely you think it is that this tax comes in and gets passed. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments section. And while you're down there, make sure you hit the like button, because that's how I know if I should do more of these types of videos. And honestly, it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Hitting subscribe, that helps too. But just before we get to what the impact on house prices is, we really need to understand, well, even if this policy does come in, what's the chance that it sticks? It's 1973 and you're the Prime Minister of New Zealand. You're Norman Kirk and you won the most recent election in a landslide. You've wanted to tackle property investors for a while, so you introduced the property speculation tax, which taxes up to 90% of property investors' profits. But then, after only a few years in the job, you cark it. You die in office, and National goes on to win the next election, led by Rob Muldoon, who is a bull in a china shop. He then dumps your policy just a few years later. And this is just the first in a line of property rules that governments have brought in, only for those policies to be rolled right back the next time the opposition gets in. More recently, this happened to Jacinda Ardern's government. Remember, she got rid of interest deductibility and increased the Bright Line test, and that happened in 2021, only for the next National government to switch back to the old rules just 3 years later. So even if a capital gains tax gets passed this time, there is a chance that when the political tides eventually turn, as they always do, that the next government changes the rules right back to what it is today. But let's say that never happens. Will house prices crash if a capital gains tax comes in and stays in? Well, house prices will almost certainly keep going up over the long term. In fact, Labour's projections rely on house prices going up by 3% a year. Otherwise, there's no extra money to pay for those 3 free GP visits. Whereas in the past, a capital gains tax has been pitched as a way to slow down house price growth. If you look overseas, it often doesn't work out that way. Australia's capital gains tax, that started in 1985. Since then, house prices are up 6.5% a year. The UK, they got their capital gains tax in 1965, and since then, UK house prices went up by over 8% a year. Canada, they got their CGT in 1972. Property values are up 6.7% per year since then. And the US has actually had a capital gains tax since 1913, over 100 years. Now, my data doesn't go back that far. It goes back to the 1970s. But since the 1970s, their house prices in the United States are up 5.4% per year. So house prices can and still do go up, even if some of those capital gains are taxed. But you're probably thinking, Ed, surely this is going to have some impact on house prices, because surely not everybody's just going to ignore a capital gains tax if it comes in. Things can't stay the way they always were, and I think you're right. It will have some effect. On one hand, fewer investors will buy rental properties because this policy makes property investing relatively less profitable, because today and in the past, if you bought a property and sold it for $500K more than you bought it for, that $500K was tax-free. If this policy gets passed, you'd have to share $140K of that with the IRD. So that makes it not quite as profitable as it used to be a property investor. And so some people will say, hey, I'm not going to become a property investor. I'm not going to expand my property portfolio. And so the auction rooms might be slightly quieter. Then on top of that, some property investors will decide to sell up because right now there are baby boomers selling up their property portfolios so that they can live their best lives sipping cocktails on a cruise in the Mediterranean. And if this tax comes in, maybe a few more of them will decide to sell up a bit earlier than they otherwise would. That increases the supply of property listings and can also keep house prices a bit lower than they otherwise would be. So this policy, it could limit both demand and increase supply, both of which would mean slightly lower house prices. But there's another effect you might not be thinking about because investors are some of the biggest buyers of new build properties. So if investors start pulling back and stop buying, that would limit the supply of new properties that get built. I mean, there will still be new properties being built, but perhaps slightly fewer of them because there would then be less demand for these types of properties, so developers don't build quite as many. That's going to decrease the supply of houses that could potentially come onto the market. And then you've also got to think about the fact that some investors will decide not to sell their properties to try and avoid this tax, because if you don't sell your property, you don't pay tax on your capital gains because you haven't realised them. So some investors will decide to keep their properties and just live off the rental income instead of selling them. Well, that would decrease the number of properties for sale, also decreasing supply. And we've actually seen this, right? With the bright line test. That's New Zealand's current and kind of former version of a capital gains tax if this policy gets passed. Because every time the bright line test got tougher, the number of properties available for sale went down. And so when you tutu with the tax rules, sometimes people decide not to sell their properties. That limits supply and that increases prices. And so you've got some reasons why this tax would push property prices down. And you've got a couple of reasons why it could also pull property prices up. Now, on balance, I think that this tax would be bad for house prices. It would mean they still go up, but potentially marginally slower than they would without the tax. But the difference will be small and probably will be barely noticeable. So with all of that, if capital gains tax comes in, or if this capital gains tax comes in, will it kill property investing forever? Well, it will for some people, for those who decide not to invest, for those who maybe already invest today but will decide to get out. But it won't kill property investing for everyone, because if you buy a house for $500K and it doubles in value, yep, you got to give $140K of that to the IRD, but you still take home $360K, which is not too bad. And if you think about it, you go to work, you pay income tax. And if you work full time, there's a good chance that your marginal tax rate is higher than what the capital gains tax rate is going to be. You might be paying 33% on your income, whereas under the capital gains tax, it's going to be slightly lower, 28%. But even though you've still got to pay tax, you probably still go to work. You probably still work hard to try and get a pay rise and make even more money, even though if you make more money, you've got to pay more in tax. Because ultimately, what matters to you, avoiding tax at any cost or earning an extra dollar, keeping most of it so you can keep buying the sort of stuff that makes you happy and the stuff that you care about in life. I mean, for me, I'm young, I want to grow my wealth, I want to get ahead. Now, if this policy comes in and I've got to pay more tax on my rental properties when I sell, I will keep investing, because what matters to me isn't avoiding tax at any cost. It's thinking about, well, what do I actually get to keep and how does it impact my bank balance, my wealth and my path to financial freedom? If I've got to pay more tax, that means I need to invest more, I need to make more money so I can get ahead and be where I want to be. And if you want the game plan for how to retire rich with property, you've got to watch this next video where you'll get my whole blueprint. It includes the 9 steps to financial freedom, and you can click here to watch it now.